Hey everyone, welcome to the Zoom world. It would be really great to meet you in person, but this is almost as good. It's really great to see you as you all sort of come in and get comfortable. What you're looking at here is an overview of the next hour or so we'll spend with one another. So a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. The first is that we are going to be giving away copies of Dr. Storey's new book, Why We Are Restless, throughout the course of our open house this evening. So keep a weather eye on the chat feature below your screen. You'll see that Nico, our program manager, will be announcing winners in the chat. The next thing is that I know lots of you have brought questions this evening, questions about the programs, questions about the application process, and we want to address all of those. What I'd ask is that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not the chat and not the like a hand raise feature. Use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen in order to ask those questions. Short ones, Nico will be able to address directly, and longer, more involved ones, we're going to save for our Q&A period. But do feel free to send those questions now. Don't worry that it's not the right time. Please ask away. So what you're looking at now is an overview of all of our programs. And the Hertog Foundation offers a great deal of different programs. And so this is a great way to think about which program might be best suited to your interests and your needs. The first big distinction between the 4 different program types we're offering this summer is that 3 of them are residential, whereas 1 of them is all online. So the 3 residential programs we offer this summer are political studies, war studies, and the words that made us. And then we have 4 summer courses, all of which take place via Zoom. The second distinction between our program types is the time commitment. So you'll notice, for example, that political studies program is a full-time, full summer commitment, whereas our online summer courses are weekday evening meetings over the course of your summer. So think to yourself, if you have plans for this summer, for example, if you're interning somewhere else, if you have a job, if you're in another class, the summer courses might be well suited to your busy summer. Whereas if you're looking for a commitment that will span the whole summer, you'll be able to apply to something like the political studies program. The third distinction between the programs is eligibility. So depending on what year in school that you are eligible for different programs. War studies, for example, is the most restrictive. Students who are within 3 graduating years of one another can apply, whereas summer courses are the least restrictive in terms of eligibility, and political studies falls somewhere in the middle. So just keep an eye on those things as you choose which programs you'd like to apply for. The first of our 3 residential programs that I'll cover is the political studies program. So this is our flagship 6-week residential program. And as you look at this handy little graphic in front of you, you'll notice that each of its 6 weeks are devoted to some central political question, but each of the 6 weeks breaks up into 2 different seminars considering that question from different perspectives. So each of the 2 seminars are half the fellows in our political studies cohort. So for example, one student might take a course on the Republic in week 1, whereas another student might take the course on Gorgias in week 1. And then in week 2, they could be together for King Lear and the Tempest before splitting up again for the American founding and democracy in America. So they're not 2 tracks. You get to choose your course anew each week. And the session as a whole moves from contemplating theory or philosophy to contemplating political practice. In the political studies program, it is, again, a whole summer commitment, and 36 fellows will be admitted. They'll spend their mornings in seminar, and they'll spend their afternoons sometimes free, sometimes, for example, at the Senate, meeting with the senator, sometimes on a call with a public intellectual. There are afternoon and evening events spread throughout the summer for you. And again, just to be clear about the 2 different courses, You'll be able to select your course anew each week throughout the course of the summer. Our next residential program is our War Studies program. This is an intensive 2-week seminar on the theory and practice of war. Note that this program is run directly by the Institute for the Study of War. So that has a practical implication on your application process. So if you decide that War Studies is your first choice summer program, that's your main priority for the summer, the Institute for the Study of War will read your application first, and you'll hear from them before you hear directly from the Hertog Foundation with respect to subsequent choices of program that you have. Finally, we are hosting The Words That Made Us in Washington, D.C. This is a 1-week seminar during the first week of August. It will include morning seminars and afternoon events. And 15 fellows in this seminar will study constitutional questions through the lens of law and history. We also have online programs this summer. So our summer courses are 4 different online seminars given via Zoom, each of which considers one focused topic. So these courses will all meet at different evenings throughout the summer, and they're particularly well suited to busy students who are already engaged in other summer activities or internships or jobs, things like this. In each summer course, the seminars will meet via Zoom, and outside of class, you'll also have some resources for community building. We use Slack in the Hertog Foundation as a great way to talk with one another, with peers in the program, with Hertog staff, with your professor. And then we'll host extracurricular activities, like we've screened in the past documentaries, we've done dramatic readings of plays, and then a popular feature of these courses is a discussion paper, which is a very short reflection or analysis that you present to the class as a way to get discussion going. And students tend to really, that really resonates with them as an experience. As you think about putting together your application for these programs, what you'll see is this nice little screen clip I took of our website. This is our application is housed on the Hertog Foundation website. All applications must be in by March 1st of this year. If you've been nominated, and you'll know that you've been nominated because you'll receive an email detailing the specifics of your nomination, you'll have received a personalized link in that email to apply through. So if you've already received a link, use that, don't go to the website. You only need to submit one application for multiple programs. And in that application, you'll be able to rank your priorities for each program. Once you submit your application, you'll receive an email notifying you of your status as a finalist. And at that point, Nico will reach out to you to schedule a 30-minute interview with either Cheryl or myself. And then accepted fellows will be notified of their acceptance via email. Our application has 6 components. You'll need to fill out the application form, which is basically just sort of biographical information about you. You'll need to include your resume, an unofficial transcript, a statement of purpose, a writing sample, and either an academic reference or letters of recommendation. I'll talk more about the references and letters of recommendation in a moment, but I just want to note right now that all of these components will be part of one online submission. So be sure that you have some of these components ready, like for example, your statement of purpose and your writing sample, have them ready as PDFs or Word documents so that you can upload them into the application as you prepare to submit. We get a lot of applications. They're very competitive, and many applicants ask us what good strategies are for standing out. So here I'll just offer some tips as you consider completing your application, for things to think about as you work towards submission. The first thing is that you should proofread your application. That doesn't mean proofread just the online component, but also take a second look at your resume, take a look at your writing statement, or your writing sample, your statement of purpose. Even better is having a friend or a mentor proofread your application for you so that you feel confident in its cleanliness and good order as you work to submit. The next thing you should think about is your statement of purpose. This should not be your resume in paragraph format. Rather, it's the best way we have to get a sense of who you are as a person, as a thinker. So share with us, what are some, say, ideas or texts or paradoxes or problems that interest you? What are intellectual engines for you? And talk about those. We oftentimes read your statement of purpose first as we're reading applications because it gives us the best sense of who you are. The next thing to think about is your writing sample. Here, it's pretty simple. We're just interested in the best writing you have. So the writing sample is our best chance at understanding kind of your habits of mind as you approach problems, as you approach texts. So what we're interested in is your best writing, not writing that you think might be relevant. All of these writing samples need to be 10 pages maximum, but we would much rather read, say, like a 3-page exposition of the first chapter of the book of Job, or a reflection on Federalist 1, rather than a longer paper that you think might be more relevant to the course material. Basically, in short, send your best writing, full stop. Finally, just another note, just to put a finer point on the letters of recommendation and references. You'll only ever need to do either one or the other. So there's not a situation in which you're going to have to submit both academic references and letters of recommendation. Whether you need to do one or the other depends on two things. The first is what program you're interested in, and the second is your applicant status. So let's talk about programs first. All war studies applicants, even if you're nominated and expedited and sponsored, no one exists like that, but just for the sake of this argument, no matter who you are, if you are interested in war studies, no matter what, you have to submit 2 letters of recommendation. So that's point one. The second point is that if you aren't one of these special applicant statuses, you'll need to submit 1 letter of recommendation for any other Hertog program for this summer. So then a couple of notes just about special applicant statuses. Nominees will know who you are. If there are nominees, I think, in the audience now, and you'll know who you are because you'll have received an email from us notifying you of your status as a nominee. Here, don't submit a letter of recommendation because your nomination by your professor or a friend functions as your letter of recommendation. Similarly, sponsored and expedited applicants will know who you are because you'll have similarly received an email from us. And in that case, you similarly don't need to submit a letter of recommendation. Our website details this information as well. So if this was quick for you, you can look there under our application page. And if you're still curious, do feel free to email one of us. So we've been talking a lot about the programs themselves and about the application process for the programs, but there is life after your experience in the Hertog Foundation. We have an alumni network of nearly 1,500, and they are worldwide. And as part of our alumni network, you will be part of a pretty close-knit community. One thing you'll receive as an alumni is a newsletter every week detailing job opportunities, internship, fellowship ideas, academic conferences, special events, and a curated list of what we as the Hertog staff are reading and watching. You'll also receive advice and direction of alumni who have gone before you. So one of the nice things about the Hertog Foundation Alumni Network is that lots of people are very motivated and their dreams tend to map onto one another. And so you'll often be able to find within the Hertog Alumni Network a mentor who can speak to the questions you might have about the next step you'd like to take in your career. And so now let's turn to our question and answer section. But before we do so, I would like to give a warm congratulations to a winner of Why We Are Restless by Ben and Jenna Storey. I will let Nico announce that in the chat. If you are here and you think you might be a winner, keep an eye on the chat so that you can collect your winnings. And let's take it now to Cheryl Miller, Executive Director.
Hello all, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. We will bring you the main event shortly, but we're going to answer some questions first that you had about our programs. So Anne, you want to take it away with the first question?
Sure. So we have a question. Can you explain the argumentative essay we have to submit? It says any subject is accepted on the FAQ. Would it be okay if we submitted an English essay arguing about a book?
Sure. So Anne did address this earlier, but I really do want to reiterate, which is we want to see your best work, paper that you're proudest of. Sometimes students see the maximum writing limit, page limit, and they think of that as a ceiling, which is like, I will be disadvantaged if I don't send in a 10-page paper, if I send in this 5-page paper, even though it got an A+, even though my nominator said, I love this paper that this student wrote about the Lyceum address. And instead you send a 10-page research paper on Estonian energy futures, which you have never thought about again. If you love Estonian energy futures, don't get me wrong. You can send that paper and we can talk about it. But sometimes students send papers because they want to reach that limit because they think quantity has a quality of its own, as Stalin said. And so you want to get those pages in there and make sure we read them so we really engage with your application. Don't think about it that way. Again, think about your best paper. We understand politics broadly, right? Aristotle says politics is the architectonic science. Basically, that means we accept writing across the curriculum. Everything is political. And so you can send us literature papers, you can send us theology papers, you can send us STEM papers, but think about that. Like if you send me a super technical paper about physics, our selection committee will find that slow going. We may ask you for another paper. So, think about your audience here, which is we're not STEM majors, and we may not understand your tricky calculations. But otherwise, we do accept papers across the curriculum, philosophy of science. You think about it, if it belongs to the liberal arts, we will want to see it.
Nice. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. We are totally open to anything that you are passionate about and interested in, think is excellent. Our next question. Good evening. Are there any restrictions or changes to the process for international applicants regarding stipends or other aspects of the course?
So for international applicants, I guess there are a few things that I would keep in mind. First, if you are interested in one of the summer courses because you're abroad and it's easier for you to zoom in online, do think about the time zone. Like we are not in the singularity yet. And so what time it is during the day or the night will matter to you. You may not care. And we certainly have had students who are like, we've had a student join us from Iraq. And so it was like 3 a.m. In his time when he was doing the course, and he just woke himself up and I guess napped during the day, whatever. So it is possible to do that, but do keep it in mind. Sometimes students are shocked to find out that 6 p.m. Eastern time really means 6 p.m. in Washington, D.C. and not 6 p.m. their time. So make that, adjustment for yourself. If you're thinking about our residential programs, there may be visa requirements for that, depending on what country you're coming from. So that's something that you should think about and be prepared for. Unfortunately, we can't help you with that. We don't have the staff or the expertise to do that. So that's something that you'll have to kind of work out on your own. If there are things like letters and such that we have to send on your behalf, of course, we're happy to, but that's a process you're going to have to lead. The other thing is on stipends. In order for us to pay you as an international applicant, you either have to have a social security number, which you could if you're a foreign student studying in the US, for example, right now, or you have to have an ITIN, which is called an individual tax identification number. And you can request that from the IRS. However, they have a huge backlog going on because of the pandemic, and they are slow in the best of times. I mean, I think this is like 6 to 8 weeks, although I don't know that we've ever gotten an ITIN in 6 to 8 weeks, and much longer. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. And unfortunately, we cannot legally pay you without that number from that all important number from the IRS, or else we will get in trouble. And I don't want to go to jail on your behalf. So you should think about that. If the stipend is really important and it's the only thing that would enable you to do the course, then that's a big risk to be taking and maybe you shouldn't apply. So that's something for you to think about. I'm sorry that it is that way, but I unfortunately don't run the IRS. If I did, my tax bill would be a lot lower, and you would get your ITIN faster. But that's not the case, not the universe we live in, and so you have to think about that. The only other thing I would add is that your your level of English proficiency needs to be very high to take this course, and both speaking and writing. So that's something you should take into account too. I don't require you to give us an aptitude or proficiency score to show us. We can see that in your writing, and if you advance to the finalist stage, we will be able to tell when we interview with you. But that's really important. We're talking about texts that are difficult for native English speakers. And so it requires a really high level of fluency.
Our next question, if you apply to more than one program, can you get into one and not the other? Or if it's possible to get into both, are you allowed to select which you would prefer attending if you're not entirely sure what your summer will look like before applications are due?
Sure. So it is possible. Obviously, you could apply to as many programs as you want. So if you want to apply to everything that we have on offer, you're very welcome to do that. Again, just one application, you'll be able to rank them. But the question of, can you get accepted to 2 programs? You know, I think that this is going to be, it's possible. I think that this is probably going to be unlikely in most cases. We have a competitive enough pool right now that I think will probably be one per customer to kind of spread the boon, the wealth of the liberal arts to as many students as we can this summer. So I don't think we'll be making a lot of joint offers. The one exception is because we review applications separately from war studies. It's possible that they could make an offer and we could make an offer. And then you could, of course, choose between those. If you're just applying to courses, you're not applying to war studies, you're just applying to courses within the Hertog Foundation, we consider your first choice first. And so we consider you with that entire pool. And then if you're not selected for that, then we go to your subsequent pools. So we do take into account your preference.
Our next question, I was nominated by someone for the political studies program, so I understand that I don't need a letter of recommendation. But what does the academic reference entail? Is it just a few words from a professor?
No, so your professor is done. If they've nominated you, thank you, we love them. When they nominate you, they typically send some words of praise in your favor. And we use that, that's your letter of recommendation. We trust our nominators. And so we know that they're sending us great people. So you don't have to send us anything else. When academic reference is requested, just provide their name, their contact information, obviously their institution. You'll be prompted for these fields. They're very straightforward. And that's all you have to do. You are done. Your nominator is done.
Our next question.
Oh, go ahead, Anne. You got another question for me?
Another question. If we are applying to multiple programs, should we talk about each program in the application and specify our first choice?
I think that you should, that's a little hard because I do see some personal statements which do weave in the different courses or programs that they're interested in, and that can work. I think what you want to avoid is like one paragraph about political studies, then one paragraph, especially if you're applying to a lot of courses. I think that you can then be, you can be broader, maybe kind of group courses by interest. So for example, if you're interested in our course about the Supreme Court and the words that made us, right, you can talk about your interest in constitutional law. So as opposed to, you know, just having the kind of list of courses and like, I'm also interested in foreign policy, that kind of thing. Be a little more thematic, right?
How many more questions would you like to entertain?
We got 5 minutes before Ben comes. I do see a question in the chat about the personal statement, and that is so important that maybe we should answer it.
Sure. Oh, personal statement. Okay, for the personal statement, can you give some more detail about it? And how would acceptance be affected if we are not accepted into our priority program, but wrote about our priority program in the statement?
So for the personal statement, as Anne said, right, it should be thematic. It should really talk about the ideas that you're interested in. It should also be right, we don't necessarily want a cover letter where you list the things that you've done in your resume, again, in paragraph form. We do want a more personal side of it, but you also want to kind of avoid the trap of, or the pitfall of the college application essay, which sometimes has a dramatic anecdote at the beginning, and then talks about like what house of Harry Potter you want to belong to or something like that. Right. You want to convey a certain seriousness about ideas and what you're going to bring to the conversation, because that's what we're looking to build, is a good conversation around, you know, whether it's our actual seminar table or our virtual seminar table. So we do want to see the ideas, the books, the questions that really drive you. Those tend to be the best. You don't need to talk about every single program that you're interested in. Hit the highlights and weave them in again so that it feels natural, not just like, I'd like to be in Washington, D.C., and so I'd like to do these things. All right, do we have time for one more question? Or
one more question. What is the time commitment for the online summer courses beyond the weekly Zoom meetings?
The only requirement is the weekly Zoom meetings. So those run for 2 hours. And they'll have weekly meetings that those dates will be given to you well in advance. It is necessary to attend all of those meetings in order to be eligible for the stipend. But after that, there are no other time commitments on you. You may want to join some of the extracurricular activities that we will have and that our teaching assistants will help organize to help the class get to know each other better, but those aren't required. We know that you may have other obligations going on during the summer. And so those are kind of the cherry on top if you so choose to partake, but it's not necessary.
And a related question, can one still attend programs without receiving a stipend?
Well, I guess, does that question suggest that you plan to miss a lot of sessions of the course? Because that, like, what is the purpose of that for you? I guess I would say.
I think the question is designed for an international
I see.
situation.
So yeah, I mean, if you're coming in with the idea of like, I'm going to have to miss like 2 sessions of this 4-session course, like you've missed 50% of the course, that's not great. So it will not put you in good standing with the Hertog Foundation in the future. I should say, we are not a one and done program. A lot of our alumni come back. We'll probably have a number of alumni participating in some of the programs that we have going on this summer. So, you know, we do, when you commit to a course, we expect that to be a good faith commitment. You know, obviously emergencies come up, you can't help that, but we're really hoping, we're striving for full participation from everyone so we can give you your stipend. But if you are an international student and you realize like you do not want to do the mountain of paperwork that the IRS requires you and then wait and haggle with the IRS for weeks on end, that's totally fine. You can just tell us that you're going to forego your stipend in that case. And sometimes international students do that because it really is a hassle. And sometimes the stipend just doesn't make up for the time that you lose and the sanity.
We have a question about the residential programs. Are there any dining accommodations for the residential programs?
Dining. We have some meals in common as a group, but at our university partner, we have we'll have dormitory accommodations for all of those programs. The students are set up in quads. There's a kitchen in each of those quads, and it has you know, basic place settings, pots and pans, so you can cook, but there's no cafeteria on site. DC is a very walkable city. There are some grocery stores in the nearby area, so it's easy to get what you would like. And then again, we have some common meals as well together. And for with the words that made us the shorter program, we will have more meals in common. That's kind of a long-term program, whereas for political studies, for example, on the weekends, you're on your own. And then sometimes into the evenings, that kind of thing, you have more free time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Another question about the writing sample. What if I have a writing sample that exceeds 10 pages? Can I just cut it off and submit it? Or would you prefer a full paper with finished ideas?
So my preference would typically be for the full paper with the finished ideas. if you feel really strongly, like sometimes students really want to send their thesis, but their thesis is like 50 pages. And you have to realize like we get hundreds of applications. And so if I read everyone's thesis, that would be probably fairly enjoyable and I would learn a lot. But I also would not give you a determination on the timeline that you would hope for. And so it'd be like, you were accepted for this summer, except it's already passed, which would not do you any good. So unfortunately, we do have to keep you to a page limit. If there is something that you really want to submit and you're going to excerpt it, it really does help to give some explanation of what it is that I'm receiving. So it's not just like a clip that, you know, like, what does this belong to? So to tell us a little bit about it. And also I'd like to see the argumentative or more analytical part of that paper. Sometimes students give us like the lit review part excerpt, and that's great. It shows that you're very good at, you know, putting all that material together, but then we don't have any sense of what were your conclusions. Like where did all of this research lead? And so, you know, that I guess that leaves me wanting more. So maybe that's a good strategy. I don't know. But usually you're not really sure what to do with that. So I'd really like to see like maybe a short paragraph in italics. What is this that I'm seeing? What part of the paper am I looking at, so that I can kind of orient myself as to what this part is in terms of the whole.
Just two things. First of all, just a finer point on the food and drink point we made a moment ago. War studies does include all meals. So the residential political studies program does not, but war studies does. And then our final question before we'll turn to our special guest, Dr. Storey, would submitting a literature review be appropriate for the writing sample?
Again, I mean, anything can be appropriate. You can break any rule if you know what you're doing, probably. Well, not some federal laws. But I mean, in terms of the writing sample, yes, that's possible. I would dissuade you from doing it in the most part, because again, I really want to see your thoughts rather than your summaries of other people's thoughts. Like I want to get a sense of who you are and how you think. And it's hard to do that from a literature review. So really encourage you, again, if you want to excerpt a longer paper, give us the meat of the paper. Give us your conclusions, give us your analysis, give us your ideas, not other people's.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. All right, Ben, how are you?
Doing well, Cheryl. Thanks so much for having me here.
Great. So we are now on to the main event, and we are excited to host you all for a conversation that I hope that is going to give you a teaser of what her talk is like, and in particular, the political studies program. So our guest is Dr. Ben Storey. He's a longtime instructor for the political studies program and our titular political philosopher in Washington, D.C. Ben, along with his wife and fellow philosopher Jenna Silver Storey, is currently a visiting fellow at AEI, a think tank here in Washington, D.C. that some of you may be familiar with. He came to AEI from Furman University, where he and Dr. and Mrs. Storey led the Tocqueville program and taught in the politics department. And the two Dr. Storeys, as we mentioned, are the authors of this recent book, Why We Are Restless. You can't actually see it very well because of the glare, but it actually has a very nice cover. You can go to that Princeton University Press page that I chatted you earlier, but it draws on the wisdom of Montaigne, Pascal, Rousseau, and Tocqueville to explain exactly why we all feel so dissatisfied. And if you were wondering why you're restless, we're going to continue raffling this book so there's more chances to win. Again, just watch on the chat as Nico announces those winners. So for our format tonight, I'm going to begin by asking Ben a few questions, and then I'm going to cede the floor to you all. You should submit your questions again using that Q&A feature that you used earlier to submit questions for me and Anne. And you can start submitting questions now. There's no need to wait once again. If your question is selected, Nico will chat you and let you know. And we will actually ask you to turn on your camera and actually ask your question for yourself to Ben, so that you have a chance to actually interact with Dr. Storey. So be prepared for that. If you prefer not to turn on the camera, maybe because you're watching this from home in bed, and you still have your PJs on or something, that's fine. Just let Nico know that you are not prepared and I will intervene on your behalf. So Ben, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me here. Teaching Her Talk is always one of the delights of my year, and I never expected to have a book that I wrote as a raffle prize. So I'm particularly thrilled on this
Trying to help
on
the
this
cause of
occasion.
your royalties.
That's right. Royalties are always a cause that needs help. So
Exactly. Well, and find it wherever the finest bookstores where your books are sold. You can find this here. So if you don't win it, you should go ahead and grab it on Amazon or your favorite local bookseller. All right. So Ben, for many of the students listening to this conversation, if they're anything like the students that I talk to at Her Talk, which I assume they are, you seem to be living the dream, or were living the dream. You study political philosophy at a top school, and we were actually graduate students together. You actually finished, and I didn't. You landed a tenured job despite a really challenging job market, which I'm sure these students have heard a lot about. And you got paid to read and think and write about Plato, about Tocqueville, about Rousseau. Many of our students really take seriously the idea that maybe the highest human life is the contemplative or the philosophic life. And you're leaving that all aside. You're coming down from these Empyrean heights to descend into the world of politics and policy. So tell me, why would a philosopher want to come to Washington, D.C.?
Well, thanks very much for the question, Cheryl. It's way too flattering. In the first place, I would never call myself a philosopher, although I'm somebody who loves the study of philosophy. I think the proper answer to your question really has two parts. The first concerns what we wanted to learn from this experience, and the second concerns what we want to do during our time in Washington, D.C. So my wife and I have spent about 30 years on college campuses. We love these places. We love the work that goes on in these places. We love the rhythms of campus life. I think particularly of the nervous energy that goes into the first day of teaching, the bright young faces out there in those little uncomfortable desks. This has been a delightful line of work for us for many years, but we've always practiced a particular kind of philosophy, and the kind of philosophy that we've always studied has been political philosophy. And what's distinctive about political philosophy? Political philosophy puts political questions first. That's where it begins. And I have always thought, and I think this more and more, that that's the appropriate way to approach philosophic questions. That is, if you begin with metaphysics or you begin with method, I think you're somehow keeping the most live and urgent human concerns off the table until much too late. And so I think this mode of approaching philosophy through politics is the right mode for approaching philosophy. But I didn't want to just continue, and my wife also didn't want to just continue thinking about politics without ever having any contact with it. And so, although we loved campus life, we decided that we wanted to come see a different way of life, and not just any different way of life, but the different way of life that we've been thinking about for the last 30 years. So that's one of the reasons that we've come here in terms of what we hope to learn. We hope to learn something by seeing something of politics firsthand. The second thing that I wanted to say concerns what we want to do as part of our work in Washington. We've been practitioners of the liberal arts for the last 30 years. We really believe in what can go on in a college classroom at its highest level. We know the experience from our own experience as undergraduates of entering a college classroom and having a great teacher and a great subject matter, a great, for example, a set of great books, open horizons that one had never previously known existed. And that's an extraordinarily valuable thing. And that's what we've dedicated our lives to doing up to this point. That activity, as I think everyone knows, is beleaguered on contemporary college campuses. It is done against the grain. In some ways, that's been the case for a long time. My own favorite undergraduate teacher was not somebody who was in an endowed chair or something like this. He was an adjunct and was working against the grain of the institution in some respects. And so one of the things we want to do while we're in Washington is try to advance the cause of genuine liberal arts education for the people who are out there on college campuses continuing to do this work.
Right, lots to follow up there. I guess to get started, as we noted in the promotional materials for this event, you are not the first philosopher to get involved with politics. And so you have this in common with the great thinkers. Flatter you some more: Aristotle, Locke, Tocqueville, Machiavelli, right? They all had practical political experience. For some of them, it didn't go so swimmingly. Hopefully you'll get out of your time in Washington without being exiled. I don't know, maybe you can get indicted. That's a classic Washington experience, probably not one that you aspire to. But happy or unhappy, as the case may be, this experience of practical politics, of political life, does seem to have afforded these great thinkers really deep insight into the nature of politics. So I'm curious, what have you learned about politics that maybe you couldn't have learned just from reading great books, however great these thinkers are, but really had to experience for yourself or see for yourself?
I just want to start by commenting on one of the first parts of your question there. I sometimes say to my students in introductory political thought classes that everybody on this syllabus went to jail, but it's true. That's something I'm hoping not to do while I'm here. But who knows? I think we've been reading and talking about the best that has been thought and said about political life from many different ages and many different places for many years. And the wisdom that one can gain from reading books like Aristotle's Politics or Plato's Gorgias, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that kind of wisdom seems to me to be invaluable. But I think there's also a kind of knowledge of politics that is probably something that is just not written down. What I mean by that is this. I think if for those in the audience, if you've ever known someone or been a witness to events that you've later read about in the newspaper, you'll often discover that there's an enormous gap between what shows up in the newspaper story and what you actually know of the people and events in question. And that's true even for the best and most celebrated journalistic operations. They almost always miss and sometimes even distort the real story of what's happening. We suppose with respect to politics that there's probably a great deal of political knowledge, political wisdom that is simply never written down, that you can only get by talking to actual practitioners. And that's one of the wonderful things about being at a place like the American Enterprise Institute. AEI's economists have worked at places like the Federal Reserve. Their foreign policy people have been in the military or at the State Department. Their constitutional law people have actually been practitioners of constitutional law. So these are people with actual experience in the trenches, and we're hoping to learn a lot from those people about the unwritten knowledge of politics that I think can only be accessed firsthand.
Well, I do want to have you say something in favor of political philosophy. It wouldn't be her talk otherwise. So how do you think your training in the liberal arts and in political philosophy has prepared you for working at AEI? It doesn't seem like necessarily an obvious hire for AEI to hire somebody who's been thinking about Plato and Rousseau, but AEI clearly thinks so. We agree. So for students in particular thinking about political life, like why should they be reading the great books? Why should they be studying the liberal arts rather than like practical things like communications or campaigning that they'll need to actually be good at their jobs?
That's a great question. I think on the, in terms of what they should be studying and what they're going to need to be good at their jobs, they should listen in part to the people who might hire them. And I think a lot of those people will tell them straight out, there's no way you're going to learn what I need you to know in college. We're going to teach you what we need you to know to work well in this organization. What we need What we need you to have is the ability to ask good questions, the ability to deal with disagreement, the ability to write good papers, the kinds of abilities that are cultivated through a liberal arts education. And so on the one hand, I think that's something of the argument against trying to get practical too quickly. The other hand, I think what we might be able to bring to a place like AEI is as follows. What we're going to work on specifically concerns the relationship of liberal education and liberal democracy. We're people who believe deeply in liberal education, and we think that liberal education and liberal democracy are a package deal. That is, that you can't have the one separate from the other. And so we think that the kind of crisis of liberal education in our country right now is entirely intertwined with the political crisis that many of us are so worried about. And so we want to speak to these kinds of questions. I think lots of people looking around right now see this as a really propitious moment for higher education reform. That is, there are winds blowing, there are opportunities being created that lots of people are starting to take advantage of in an effort to do something like revive the liberal arts as they're practiced at their best. The difficulty with this kind of practical work, including practical reform work that has the very best intentions, is that one has to keep one's eyes on the end, the aim, the purpose, if one isn't going to get distracted by the means. That is, a practical life can be seduced by what my wife and I have written about as merely reactive pragmatism. That is, you try to navigate by simply tacking with whatever winds are blowing, responding to whatever's coming at you, and you lose sight of the overall aim of your projects. And so we want to go to work on questions of liberal education and liberal democracy on the basis of long experience in classrooms attempting to practice liberal education, but even more so on the basis of the kind of reflection on human nature and its fulfillment that liberal education properly understood has to aim at, that we've gotten through 30 years of the study of the kind of books that one reads at the Hurt program and encounters with the kinds of teachers that you all have on your docket.
And I do encourage you all to send in questions for Q&A. You don't have to ask questions directly on this topic. You have a great opportunity here to ask Dr. Storey about grad school, about think tanks, get his seasoned advice, having been in both of these worlds. So, do send them in. And then I'll ask my final question and then turn things over to our audience. So Ben, I do want you to talk a little bit about the course that you're going to be teaching for political studies this summer. This is our opening course, and it gets at one of the big themes I think that students are really interested in, this question of virtue and power. Like, are these two things compatible? Is it possible to live well, to be a good person, be a good citizen, but also climb that ladder of ambition and possibly gain power and influence in order to affect our civic life, our joint civic life? So we're going to be exploring this question through a reading of Plato's Gorgias. And that's what you'll be teaching. Ryan Hanley will be teaching in the other section, the Republic, but also looking at this question. So I want you to give a teaser for the course, explain why your course is better than Ryan Hanley's work. So for anyone who gets selected, they'll know this is the superior course. Why the Gorgias in particular, and how does it help us to better understand the competing demands of justice and politics?
Well, thanks for the question. And of course, my class will be superior to Ryan. Just so everyone knows, Ryan is yet another of Cheryl and I's graduate school classmates. And so in truth, you're going to be you'll be in very good hands with Professor Hanley, if you apply to the program and get in, and that's where you end up. The reason I propose teaching the Gorgias for this first week of the Hurt program a few years ago, because it seemed to me to be the book most ideally tailored to speak to the drama that I saw going on in the souls of Hurt students. You could see this in students everywhere, but I think it's particularly acute in the kind of people who come to Hurt. And that is, Hurt students tend to be extraordinarily bright and capable and ambitious. They are driven. They work hard. They have lots to say. There's tons of things going on in their heads, and they want to do something in the world. They want to have some influence, and that desire is entirely fitting for people like them. On the other hand, most of them come from really good homes. They've had impressive upbringings, and they want to live good and honest lives. They want to be good citizens. They want to be upright people who are worthy of the admiration of their community. And these two desires are very powerful in their souls. I think, as all of us know, of course, the desire to be good and the desire to do well are desires that can come into conflict. And I think that conflict is dramatized with extraordinary power in Plato's Gorgias, which is a dialogue between Socrates, who is, of course, a philosopher who lived in 10,000-fold poverty, who people accused him of lots of stuff, but never venal corruption. And Callicles, who is this hot-headed young man who is interested in power and pleasure and wealth, and thinks that the way of the world dictates that someone with those interests has to be willing to do whatever it takes to ascend the heights of wealth and influence. Socrates is willing to make tremendous sacrifices for the way of life that he recommends. Yeah, he is famously the first martyr of philosophy, and Callicles thinks that Socrates is living in a dream world, a charge that Socrates actually, interestingly, turns around and levels at him. And so in this dialogue, you see in very extreme form this tension that is in the souls, I think, of all of us, between our desires for material, worldly success, and our desire to get our souls in order, our desires to live a harmonious life. And so that's why I thought this book would be the best book with which to begin the Hertog program, because I think it speaks directly to the most intense interests of the people involved in this program.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a pretty good, compelling teaser. And so we'll see if these students agree or they all sign up for Ryan Hanley's course. All right. Let's get started. I think we're going to bring Bryce Toon on screen. He's going to materialize here like magic in just a moment. Let's see. There you are, Bryce. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Bryce, just before you get started, tell us what institution you're with, what you're majoring in, so we know a little about you.
Yeah, so I'm from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I'm currently a senior double majoring in political science and religious studies with a concentration on Islam and Hinduism.
Great. All right,
Yeah.
Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, so I think what Dr. Storey is saying is very interesting, and obviously for someone who's interested in kind of moral virtue kind of questions, philosophical questions to help guide me as I go throughout life, these kind of things are very important to me. But my question kind of extends to people who are not like me, people who are not applying to the Hertog Foundation. As someone who has an interest in pursuing law, potentially politics, and working in public service, I find it confusing on how to engage with people who have not considered these questions themselves, and oftentimes have not been trained to do so. And relatedly, oftentimes don't have the time or space to think about it, particularly if they come from lower income families or marginalized communities. Which is particularly resonant for me because I am from that background. So I just wanted to know what your thoughts on that was.
Thanks, Bryce. I really appreciate the question. Let me recommend to you a book by Roosevelt Montas, who is the director of Columbia University's Freedom and Citizenship program. He used to be the director of the core curriculum at Columbia. And Roosevelt Montas is somebody who emigrated to the United States from the Dominican Republic. He showed up, as he says, with a head full of lice and a gut full of intestinal parasites. And he found, so he's living in Queens, and he found a copy of Plato's Dialogues in a garbage pile outside of his Queens apartment. And he made his way from this copy of Plato's Dialogues through conversations with a great high school teacher who was really interested in these things, to Columbia University. And now, through his Freedom and Citizenship program, he tries to make that experience available to kids from New York high schools without a lot of income, many of them from minority families. And I think one of the things that Professor Montas is most convincing about is that there's a tremendous danger in thinking that the questions at the core of the liberal arts, questions like the meaning of life, questions like what is justice, what is the good life, what is happiness, what is virtue, what is holiness, that those questions are questions only for privileged people. They're not. They're questions every human being wants to ask, and they're questions that our country has a distinctive and powerful tradition in making available to untold numbers of human beings. If you talk to people who've gotten their university educations in other parts of the world, they'll tell you, for example, I lived in Australia for a couple of years. And when you graduate high school in Australia, you immediately begin your professional training. There is no liberal arts college experience for most people in that country. The United States has a long tradition of poor schoolmasters getting on a horse with some Cicero in their saddlebags and striking out west and founding a college. This has happened again and again. And Americans, from the very beginning, thought common citizens needed these things. And so Harvard was founded when the Pilgrims were only 16 years off the boat. So we really believe that liberal education is not just an important experience for people who are going on to rule, but is an important experience for the common democratic citizen. And so in this sense, I think we ought to try to make this as widely available as we possibly can. That's not to say that it doesn't have special relevance for people who are going on to positions of power and influence, who really need that education all the more insofar as they're going to influence the lives of lots of other people in lots of different areas of their existence. And it's only something really that, like liberal education, that can allow you the capacity for really capacious thought that is necessary for positions of broad responsibility.
I really appreciate that response, and I couldn't agree more that I do think that these questions are really important for everybody to have access to. And I will definitely look into this, the book that you recommended, and see if that helps me guide me in that question.
Again, the book is Roosevelt Montas, Rescuing Socrates, a wonderful book.
We just put that link in the chat for everyone. So another great book, finest booksellers. All right, thank you so much, Bryce. Great question. We've got next up, Madeline McMaster. All right, there we go. Hi, Madeline.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
And again, can you tell us your institution, what you're majoring, so we know a little bit about you?
Yes, I'm a student at Villanova. I'm a sophomore currently, and my major is both poli-sci and English. So something that I've been really interested in lately is, as I get more into political philosophy, is how can we make liberal arts education available not only to college-age students, but to younger children in the US too, and like prepare children for a liberal arts education in high school and college, and how can we reform our education system to do that?
Thanks so much for the question. This is something that I've to my own surprise, I actually have some experience and thoughts about. About, let me think now, I want to say, it's not quite, yeah, it's about 5 years ago. We had our children in the public schools. I'm a public school product. My wife is a public school product. Her parents are wonderful public school teachers. And we had been in that world our entire lives and felt pretty loyal to it. But for a series of circumstances combined to cause us to pull our kids out and put them into a classical school. And this experience was truly a revelation. This school that we had them in is Veritas Academy down in Greenville, South Carolina. It's a startup. It was founded by a group of 7 parents who got together around a living room table because they were discontent with the educational alternatives that were available in our town, although there were plenty of things that would normally be described as good going on there. And they founded a school. And a few years later, there were hundreds of students. I can't remember the exact number, but there were hundreds of students at the school within less than a decade. And so this has been an extraordinary experience of seeing what ordinary Americans can do when they put their minds to it. And one of the things that's been so wonderful about this school is watching what it has done for my children, the kinds of things that they're reading. My oldest is now writing poetry in Latin. My kids can recite long poems. They my 11-year-old does a really wonderful rendition of Byron's "The Destruction of Sennacherib," which is really I mean you guys should read this poem. It's incredible. But it's remarkable to hear my 11-year-old recite this. I never recited a poem when I was a middle school student. My oldest, again, one of the experiences that we had arriving here, where we've got our kids in classical schools, was one evening she came out on our back porch clutching her copy of Plato's Timaeus. She's 15, Plato's Timaeus. And she looked at me and she says, "He said everything I've ever thought in these 2 paragraphs." and I thought, wow, the move was worth it, because this sort of thing was possible for her. This kind of education, the schools that we've had our kids in ever since, they're private, but they're not that expensive. And there are some of them that are that take up this classical model that are public schools, the public charter system called the Great Hearts Network down in Texas and Arizona. We've sent a number of our best students on to teach there, and those schools are simply terrific. And so this is a matter of really fundamental educational reform. What people in classical schools are doing are really, they're going back behind the progressive educational revolution that happened at the beginning of the 20th century, and they're recovering a very long tradition of liberal education, which did not used to be the purview of people between the ages of 18 and 22. There's lots of stuff that you all are at the right time of life to think about. But this kind of education can definitely start earlier. It can definitely start with younger people. And it's really extraordinary what this model of education is doing with young people all around the country right now.
Thank you very much. That's something that I've been wondering about a lot lately.
And Madeline, you might take a look. I just put in the chat a link to a great article by National Affairs, which is a magazine you all should check out. It's edited by Yuval Levin, who is Ben's colleague at AEI and also an instructor for the Hertog political studies program and other programs that we run. But it's by a great Hertog alum, Ian Lindquist, about the classical education movement in America and how this liberal education is becoming more available to students through the charter school movement. So highly recommend that. All right, so I will be asking now a question on behalf of Ethan Sperla, who's at Stanford University. He's majoring in economics and international security studies, and he actually wants to know about your restlessness book. So his question is, having studied theology, I was curious if you could differentiate the restlessness referenced in St. Augustine's prayer. So I assume this is from the Confessions, our hearts are restless until they find you, versus modern restlessness. So he'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Okay, great. So the book we wrote is called Why We Are Restless, and we talk about restlessness, beginning with Alexis de Tocqueville's observation. When he came to America in the 1830s, he thought, wow, these are the freest, most prosperous people the world has ever seen. He thought there was nothing like what was going on in the United States. He was very aware of America's defects. He wrote the longest chapter of Democracy in America about slavery. And so he had his mind very much attuned to that stuff, but nonetheless, he thought like, wow, the American middle class, this huge class of people living these prosperous lives, this is totally unprecedented. And so he was very impressed. And nonetheless, he looked at these Americans and he said, wow, they're restless in the middle of their prosperity. Their minds are constantly wandering. They're constantly jumping from job to job, from place to place, from house to house. Why are they doing this? Why can't they sit still and be happy? And so Tocqueville put this question in our minds, and as did our experience living in this country. But and Tocqueville sees this as a historical phenomenon, something that is somehow more acute or more widespread in the United States than in most countries. And so, with respect to the question of this more ancient form of restlessness, or one might say this permanent form of restlessness that you've described, and you're absolutely right, that Augustine famously says our hearts are restless until they rest in you at the very beginning of the Confessions. So what's new in modern restlessness? And the argument that we make in this book is that experience certainly is a permanent human experience. But one way to understand what the modern world is all about is that we live in an experiment. And the experiment is the effort to tame the restless longings of the human soul. In particular, that question that all of us are inclined to ask, that is, what is the good life? What is the summum bonum? What is the highest good? What would really make me happy? Some early modern philosophers, and we focus on Michel de Montaigne, thought that question was really dangerous. And they thought it was really dangerous for a good reason. Montaigne lived through 30 years of religious war, and he thought, people need to just stop arguing about this question of the highest good. And he tried to show us what life looks like if you don't think about that question. And he made it look really good. His book, The Essays, is autobiographical, and it paints a portrait of him living a life that is just like, I don't care about these kinds of questions. I'm not restless. I'm at home, here now, living my mundane, natural existence, dabbling a little bit in this pleasure and then in that one, reading a few books, doing a little traveling, having a couple of love affairs, making not too big a deal out of any of it. That, Montaigne says, is the good life. And I think the idea that we can live like that we can live nonchalantly, that's Montaigne's language. He says we should practice the virtue of nonchalance. The idea that we can live that life is an idea that I think comes to be known to almost every modern soul. And the argument of this book follows another thinker, Blaise Pascal, in suggesting that's while we may be sympathetic with Montaigne's reasons for arguing for this life, the life that he ultimately argues for just really isn't human. The way that Pascal puts it is l'homme passe l'homme. Man surpasses man. We cannot be at home with ourselves. But living in the modern world is in some ways living with an effort to do that, and living with an effort to give up on questions like the question of the human good. And that makes us restless in a distinctively modern way. That is, we're living in the aftermath of an effort to cut off the Augustinian restlessness of the human soul. What Pascal shows us is that you can expel restlessness through the door, but it climbs back in through the window. And that's what we'd say is sort of the distinction between modern restlessness and the restlessness that's permanent.
Great. And next up, we have Arjun Singh, and he has anticipated this idea about arguments. So this question could be right on target.
Yes, thank you very much, Cheryl. Thank you, Dr. Storey. Thank you for having me here as well. Just to introduce myself, I'm coming here from Canada. As you can see, the truck is behind me. They also send their regards as well. And I am a recent graduate of the University of Toronto, where I studied political science as a specialist. Here, that's something one step above a major, as well as international relations as my major, and American studies and history as my minors. And concerning this idea of argument that Cheryl just referenced, as well as dialogue and discussion, which are very important parts of Hertog as well as the philosophic tradition. I am reminded of something that John Adams once said about argumentation, and he described it as, to him, the ideal mode of conversation about issues and concepts. This is something with which I tend to agree. I see resonance of argumentation in the Socratic method, for instance, say between Socrates and Thrasymachus, Socrates and Glaucon, etc., as well as in our adversarial political system, where we have arguments all the time and find a way forward in terms of policy. However, I've often noticed that despite the best of intentions, sometimes from my end, sometimes from others, argumentation isn't always received as well by other people. They find it abrasive, they find it demeaning. And so, Dr. Storey, I'd like to ask you, what do you think is the ideal mode of conversation? And do you have any advice for how to make argumentation more palatable to others who might be not as well disposed to it?
That's a great question. And I think a lot depends on setting. So for example, as a practitioner of the classroom art of conversation for many years, yeah, I have techniques that help draw people into a conversation. So for example, particularly if I'm teaching very young students, I don't want to step on anybody the first time they open their mouths. You could be sure that if you crush somebody the first time they say something in class, you're not going to hear from that person again. And so you could, you need to avoid this kind of thing. But this varies a lot depending on where one is and what kind of students that one is dealing with. So for example, I've noticed that teaching for the Hertog program is a really different art than teaching first-year seminars. If I'm teaching first-year seminars, I need to be very gentle and coax people out and make sure that everybody feels okay and so on and so forth. Whereas if I'm at the Hertog program, one has to restrain the tremendous energy of conversation that is in the room, and one has to work very hard to guide people to have just one conversation, because there's so many things that people have to say. So many, there's so many comments in the average Hertog seminar that could be the stuff of an entire hour or an entire week. And you somehow have to choose, okay, we're going to go here and not there. And so, at Hertog, it's more a matter of directing traffic and identifying on the fly what is really worth digging into here. That's the kind of decision one has to make there. Now, I have the feeling that you're thinking about argumentative contexts in which you don't have the podium, that is, in which you're not necessarily in charge. And there, I don't know that I could be of particular help. I mean, I think the finding the mean between not being so aggressive as to drive people nuts, but also not being a doormat is exceedingly important to this kind of conversation. And moreover, this is a thing that people acquire only through habit. It's one of the things I've noticed after many years of meeting people from different walks of life is you can actually tell sometimes who's had a good liberal education by the way they approach conversation. For example, they ask questions. They, people who've had this kind of education, they often have, they want to know what you're thinking, what's going on in your life. They know that you get something out of that when you do it. And maybe if I were going to give a blanket piece of advice, that's what I would say. Ask questions. Arguing is good. Arguing is really important, and I'm glad that you care about it. I think it's an underrated thing, and it's understood far too often as a kind of hostility, which just isn't true. But inquiry, finding out what's going on with people, that makes an enormous difference too. So thanks for the question. I hope that's in some way useful. But these are not easy things in which to guide oneself.
It definitely is useful, Dr. Storey. Thank you. Your answer sort of directs me to Aristotle, who described a golden mean. And so perhaps we should sort of find the golden mean in terms of argumentation with prudence as to the situation. So I'm very grateful for that answer.
You knew my source.
Exactly. Any Hertog conversation, we've got to smuggle in Aristotle somewhere.
Right.
So I'm glad that we've done that for our final question. So thank you, Arjun. Congratulations to all our book winners. Be sure to check out, make sure your name's not in the chat. If Nico has announced you, yay, you have a cure for your restlessness, because you can't be restless when you're reading this book. Claim your book by emailing Nico as he directed you in your chat. If you missed the first part of our infomercial, or you want to revisit part of this conversation, we have recorded it. We will post it on YouTube. It'll be there tomorrow. So just check out the Hertog Foundation's YouTube account. In the meantime, I hope that you all will consider applying for our 2022 summer fellowships. If you have questions, do reach out to me or Anne. Anne is particularly friendly and approachable, and we would be delighted to answer your questions about the application or about the programs. Ben, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to talk with everybody.